The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Marcus Evans, a successful entrepreneur and local philanthropist, stood calmly at the defendant's table. The room was packed with onlookers, their expressions reflecting a mix of curiosity and tension. They had gathered not only to witness the trial, but also to observe Judge Harold Whitaker, a man infamous for his controversial rulings and rumored racial bias. Marcus, dressed in a sharp navy suit, exuded confidence, a stark contrast to the judge's stern and judgmental demeanor. His presence commanded respect, yet it was clear that Judge Whitaker had already made his assumptions. The case at hand was a minor infraction, an alleged zoning violation involving one of Marcus's properties, but the way the judge addressed him made it evident this was about more than just the law. The judge's voice boomed as he addressed the courtroom, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Marcus. "Mr. Evans, your blatant disregard for city regulations cannot be overlooked. I've seen too many cases like this where individuals think they're above the law." Marcus's attorney, visibly frustrated, rose to object, citing a lack of evidence and procedural errors. But Judge Whitaker cut him off, dismissing his arguments with a wave of his hand. "The law is clear," he declared, his tone dripping with finality. "I'm imposing a fine of $50,000, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the audience. The fine was not only excessive, but completely disproportionate to the alleged violation. Marcus remained composed, though a flicker of determination sparked in his eyes. He leaned over to his attorney and whispered something, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing within. Judge Whitaker, oblivious to the growing tension in the room, smirked smugly as he banged his gavel. "Court adjourned," he said, rising from his seat with an air of finality. The crowd erupted into hushed whispers, exchanging shocked glances as Marcus gathered his papers and walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. Little did the judge know, Marcus was far from finished. What unfolded next would challenge not only the courtroom's power dynamics, but also the very foundation of Judge Whitaker's career. The room that had just witnessed a blatant act of prejudice was about to witness a historic turning of the tables, one that no one would ever forget. Judge Harold Whitaker had built a reputation over decades as a stern, no-nonsense figure in the courtroom. To some, he was seen as an unwavering enforcer of the law. To others, especially within minority communities, he was a symbol of systemic bias in the justice system. Behind his sharp robes and booming gavel lay a history of rulings that disproportionately favored the wealthy and powerful, particularly those who resembled himself, affluent, white, and deeply entrenched in privilege. Whitaker's courtroom was notorious for its double standards. Cases involving white defendants often saw leniency, a quick dismissal, or, at worst, a slap on the wrist. In contrast, those from marginalized backgrounds found themselves on the receiving end of harsher penalties, regardless of the severity of their alleged infractions. Rumors swirled in the legal community about his prejudiced decision-making, but his position of power made him untouchable. Lawyers and defendants alike treaded carefully in his courtroom, knowing full well that challenging him could result in professional or personal repercussions. For Marcus Evans, the judge's reputation was no secret. Marcus had prepared himself for a tough battle when the zoning violation case was brought to court. What should have been a simple misunderstanding about property lines had been exaggerated into a significant legal issue, largely because of Marcus's growing prominence in the community. Marcus's story was one of resilience and triumph against all odds, Born in a low-income neighborhood, he had worked tirelessly to build his business from the ground up. His company, which focused on revitalizing underserved areas, had become a beacon of hope in the community. Marcus's developments didn't just beautify neighborhoods, they brought affordable housing, job opportunities, and a sense of pride to areas long ignored by the city's elite. But with success came scrutiny. Marcus had faced his share of challenges, backhanded compliments, outright racism, and an endless stream of bureaucratic red tape aimed at slowing his progress. Yet he never faltered. His mother's words, "Success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about what you overcome," echoed in his mind every time he hit a roadblock. The zoning issue, however, felt personal. The fine Judge Whittaker had imposed wasn't just a financial blow. It was a public attempt to diminish Marcus's credibility. Despite the judge's efforts to paint him as a rule-breaker, Marcus had followed every regulation and submitted the necessary paperwork. The case had been blown out of proportion, and Marcus suspected it was less about the law and more about who he was, a successful black man reshaping a city that had long excluded people like him. As Marcus left the courtroom that day, he reflected on the many times he had faced discrimination cloaked in authority. This time, however, he wasn't willing to let it slide. He had fought too hard to get where he was, and he wasn't about to let Judge Whittaker's bias undo years of hard work. Unbeknownst to the judge, Marcus had resources, connections, and a community that believed in him. What seemed like a quiet departure from the courtroom was, in fact, the beginning of a calculated and decisive response. Marcus was no stranger to adversity, and he knew that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about standing up against a system that had oppressed countless others like him. This wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a reckoning that would leave the courtroom, the judge, and the city stunned. Judge Whittaker leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he delivered his verdict. "Mr. Evans," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "your arrogance in this courtroom is nothing short of remarkable. A fine of $250,000 should remind you that rules and regulations apply to everyone, no matter how much you think you've achieved." The gavel slammed down with a resounding thud, and a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The gallery, filled with community members and supporters of Marcus Evans, exchanged uneasy glances. Many had hoped for fairness, but weren't surprised by the judge's decision. Marcus's calm yet confident demeanor seemed to irk Judge Whittaker from the start, and the verdict felt less like justice and more like a personal attack. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his tailored navy suit a stark contrast to the judge's stark black robe. His face betrayed no anger or frustration, only a quiet confidence that seemed out of place given the severity of the fine. He carefully folded the papers on the table in front of him, straightened his tie, and turned toward the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I appreciate your interpretation of justice." His words were polite, but the subtle pause before the word interpretation hinted at something deeper. The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Whittaker raised an eyebrow, visibly irritated by Marcus's lack of deference. "I'd suggest you take this matter seriously, Mr. Evans," he snapped. "Dismissed." As Marcus gathered his belongings, he turned to face the gallery, his gaze meeting the eyes of several supporters who had come to witness the proceedings. With a slight smile, he nodded, his confidence contagious. He walked past the court officers and toward the exit, his movements deliberate and composed. Just before he crossed the threshold, he stopped, turned back toward the judge, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll see about that, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. The words echoed through the room, leaving an air of uncertainty. Gasps and murmurs erupted once more, and even Judge Whittaker looked momentarily unsettled. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Marcus, microphones and cameras thrust in his direction. "Mr. Evans, do you have any comment on the judge's ruling?" one journalist asked. "Justice will prevail," Marcus replied succinctly. "That's all I have to say for now." He offered no further explanation, leaving the crowd hungry for answers. Behind the scenes, Marcus was already planning his next steps. His legal team had been prepared for an unfavorable ruling, given the judge's reputation, and they had contingency plans in place. Marcus's smile wasn't one of defeat. It was the expression of a man who understood that battles weren't always won in the first round. Word of the incident spread quickly, fueled by social media and local news outlets. Clips of the judge's scathing remarks and Marcus's composed response began circulating online, sparking outrage. "This is exactly why we need people like Marcus Evans," one commenter wrote. "He's fighting a system that's designed to crush anyone who challenges it." As Marcus prepared for the next phase, Judge Whittaker sat in his chambers, oblivious to the storm brewing outside the courthouse walls. To him, the matter was resolved, a lesson taught to another upstart who dared to challenge his authority. But Marcus's cryptic words lingered in the judge's mind, a nagging reminder that perhaps this battle wasn't over. Meanwhile, Marcus reached out to his network, a group of influential allies that included community leaders, legal experts, and even some former adversaries who had come to respect him. He knew that his fight wasn't just about a zoning fine. It was about challenging a system that allowed bias and prejudice to masquerade as justice. As the days unfolded, Marcus's plan began to take shape. The fine was not the end of his story. It was merely the spark that ignited a movement. By the time Judge Whittaker realized the scale of what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. Marcus wasn't just defending himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed or wronged by those in power. And this time, the tables were about to turn. The next morning, a series of breaking news alerts began flooding the local and national media. Headlines across television screens and social media read, "Entrepreneur at Center of Courtroom Drama turns out to be State Legal Oversight Advisor." The revelation sent shockwaves through the legal community and beyond. Marcus Evans, who had calmly endured the judge's prejudiced verdict the previous day, was not just an ordinary defendant. He was a high-ranking legal advisor for the state's Judicial Oversight Board, responsible for ensuring fairness and accountability in the judiciary. As the story unfolded, it became clear that Marcus had been quietly working behind the scenes to expose systemic corruption within the court system. Reports emerged that he had been compiling evidence for months, documenting patterns of judicial bias and misconduct. At the center of his investigation, none other than Judge Whittaker, whose reputation for discriminatory rulings and favoritism had long been a point of contention among local attorneys and activists. The news spread rapidly, and the courthouse was soon surrounded by reporters eager to capture the unfolding drama. Videos of the previous day's courtroom exchange resurfaced, now viewed in a completely different light. Marcus's composed demeanor and cryptic statement, "We'll see about that," suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't a vague threat. It was a declaration of accountability. Later that morning, Judge Whittaker arrived at the courthouse to find himself the center of a media frenzy. Protesters had gathered, holding signs demanding justice and accountability. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as representatives from the Judicial Oversight Board entered the building. Among them was Marcus Evans, now flanked by legal colleagues and community leaders. A formal complaint against Judge Whittaker was filed, supported by extensive documentation of his history of bias and unethical conduct. The evidence included testimony from defendants and attorneys, statistical analyses of his rulings, and even leaked internal communications that revealed a pattern of prejudice. The Oversight Board, unable to ignore the gravity of the allegations, acted swiftly. Judge Whittaker was immediately suspended, pending a full investigation. News of the suspension spread quickly, drawing cheers and applause from the community. For years, people had spoken in whispers about the judge's misconduct, but few had dared to challenge him openly. Marcus's actions gave them a voice, and his bravery ignited a collective call for change. Social media erupted with support for Marcus. Hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #Accountability in action trended nationwide. Videos of the courtroom incident continued to gain traction, with viewers praising Marcus's resilience and strategic response to the injustice he faced. "This is how you fight back. Calm, calculated, and powerful," one commenter wrote. Meanwhile, Judge Whittaker remained holed up in his chambers, grappling with the reality of his downfall. For years, he had wielded his authority unchecked, but now his actions had caught up with him. The courtroom, once a stage for his arrogance, was now a symbol of his undoing. As the dust began to settle, Marcus addressed a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about ensuring that justice isn't a privilege, it's a right. No one, not even those in positions of power, is above the law." His words resonated deeply, not just with the community, but also with legal professionals and activists across the country. The case against Judge Whittaker marked a pivotal moment in the fight for judicial reform. It was no longer about a single biased ruling. It was about dismantling a system that allowed such behavior to persist. For Marcus, the revelation wasn't the end of his journey, but the beginning of a larger battle. As the investigation into Judge Whittaker continued, Marcus remained steadfast in his mission to hold those in power accountable, proving that justice, when pursued with determination and integrity, could prevail. The fallout from the courtroom confrontation became a pivotal moment in the fight for justice and accountability within the judicial system. Marcus Evans, now at the center of a national conversation, wasted no time using his position and influence to enact meaningful change. Marcus spearheaded a campaign to address systemic issues within the judiciary, focusing on creating safeguards to prevent judicial bias and misconduct. As an advisor to the state's Judicial Oversight Board, he proposed comprehensive reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, stricter oversight mechanisms, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for defendants and lawyers to flag discriminatory behavior. One of Marcus's most significant actions was initiating a formal review of Judge Whittaker's previous rulings. With the support of legal advocates and community organizations, dozens of cases that bore the hallmarks of bias were reopened. Many fines and sentences were overturned, and wronged defendants were finally given the justice they deserved. The process was a powerful statement. No one, not even a judge, was above accountability. The judicial system's willingness to revisit these cases restored faith in many who had long felt powerless against systemic injustice. Marcus's efforts set a precedent for other states, inspiring similar initiatives nationwide. As news of Marcus's triumph spread, his business gained even more respect and admiration. Clients and partners were drawn not only to his professional expertise but also to his unwavering commitment to integrity and equality. His company flourished, becoming a beacon of ethical leadership in the corporate world. In recognition of the community's role in amplifying his story, Marcus chose to give back in meaningful ways. He donated a portion of his earnings to organizations dedicated to promoting equality, providing legal aid to underserved communities, and reforming the judicial system. Scholarships were established in his name to support aspiring lawyers from marginalized backgrounds, ensuring the next generation would continue the fight for justice. Marcus's story became a rallying cry for those who had been silenced by injustice. His calm yet decisive handling of the situation inspired countless individuals to stand up for their rights and demand accountability from those in power. He frequently spoke at events, sharing his journey and encouraging others to use their voices and platforms to create change. The once dismissive courtroom became a symbol of victory for fairness, with Marcus's actions proving that resilience and determination could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of inequality. His efforts not only corrected a personal injustice, but also paved the way for a brighter, more equitable future for all. The courtroom incident marked a turning point, not only for Marcus Evans but also for the countless individuals who had long endured systemic injustices in silence. His ability to confront bias with poise and intelligence transformed him into a symbol of resilience and change. Marcus's actions reverberated far beyond the courthouse walls, resonating with marginalized communities who had felt the weight of systemic inequality. His victory wasn't just about correcting his personal injustice. It was about illuminating the structural flaws that allowed such discrimination to persist. His story became a source of hope, proving that the fight for accountability was winnable when approached with strategy, integrity, and courage. Disgraced and stripped of his position, Judge Whittaker became a cautionary tale. His downfall served as a stark reminder of the dangers of wielding power with prejudice. For other judges and public officials, his case underscored the importance of upholding fairness and equity in their roles, knowing that unchecked bias would no longer go unnoticed or unpunished. Through public speaking engagements, interviews, and community forums, Marcus used his platform to share his journey and call for broader reform. His emphasis on collaboration and collective action inspired a groundswell of support from citizens, organizations, and policymakers alike. The changes he helped implement became a blueprint for other states seeking to address judicial bias and restore faith in their legal systems. In the months following the judge's disbarment, Marcus stood on the steps of the very courthouse where the incident had occurred. Before him was a crowd of supporters, community leaders, and media representatives. The energy in the air was electric, charged with the promise of progress. As cameras flashed and microphones captured his words, Marcus spoke with conviction. "This fight was never just about me," he began. "It was about everyone who has ever been silenced, overlooked, or unjustly punished. It was about dismantling a system that allows bias to thrive unchecked. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary, and it starts now." The crowd erupted into applause, a mixture of gratitude and hope filling the square. Marcus turned his gaze toward a group of young students standing in the front row, their faces alight with inspiration. They represented the future he had fought to protect, a future defined by fairness, opportunity, and unity. As he left the courthouse steps, Marcus paused to shake hands with individuals in the crowd. each interaction reinforcing his commitment to remain a champion for justice. The image of him walking confidently into the next chapter of his journey became a defining moment for all who witnessed it. In the years to come, Marcus's efforts continued to reshape not only the judiciary, but also public perceptions of accountability and leadership. His story became a testament to the power of resilience and the belief that, even in the face of prejudice, justice can prevail.